Okay, so traces of his movements on the canvases. And if we look at the way he titles them, number 1, 1950, right? That also adds to this idea of a sort of diary of action, right? A record of actions, numbering them through each given year, right? This is where I was at first in 1950, is basically what the title says, right? And so the canvas, as we said, stretched on the floor. Stretched is not the right word, right? Nailed to the floor. And then stretched to a canvas after completion. It becomes this place where he immerses himself, right? He enters a different environment with this. He enters into this, and he's in Jungian psychology. He's in Jungian therapy, right? So he understands this idea of sort of becoming one with those actions and trying to understand them for what they mean potentially to him and how they might relate to the collective unconscious. And the scale of these things, the mural-sized scale of these things, is very, very much part of that, right? That it's an environment that he enters into where all of his actions leave a record that he can then go back and trace. And as we dive into it, one of the things that's, I think if you spend enough time with any Jackson Pollock picture, is that it's actually anything but random. I think that there's an amazing amount of thought and preparation that moves into these different marks that he makes, even though he's not actually touching the canvas, even though there's got to be some Dada randomness to how that paint falls, right? But still, when you start to see things coming together, look at these 3 black lines here that come to an apex point there. That can't be a random thing. He's got to have some plan where he's doing this, right? And running it out. And then you find a lot of places where he'll get one drip, not in this detail, but you find a lot of places where one drip will be literally right on top of another, right? Where he's actually lining them up and building them up. And so even though there's this Jungian idea that you're catching the randomness of your actions and maybe then tapping into your subjective unconscious, right? Collective unconscious. There's also an element where he really is still painting, and he doesn't give enough credit, I think, for the degree to which these are really, I mean, he does, but not from outsiders, right? Not from the general public. Enough credit for the degree to which these are incredibly thoughtful and deliberate compositions, right? That he's letting it happen, letting it build up. Now, despite that deliberateness, there's lots of little accidents that happen as well. There's a raisin stuck inside the paint, and it's still there, right? I'm not quite sure where. I can't remember where in the country. It's like right around here, right? But yeah, there's it was eating some dried fruit. There's a cigarette pack somewhere under the paint, right? Because we saw him smoke, and it fell out, and it's there, and it's now covered with paint as a wad. This is the one I saw recently. I've never taught this before. I didn't know it was there. Can you see anything here? Right? You see this place here where it looks as if it's been smeared with something? Ew! It's a cockroach. That crawled through the wet paint. Or I don't know if he pushed it or what, but the accidents happen. Isn't that fantastic? Like, I'd never seen it. This is why you need to go to the museum and look at these things, right? Is to find them. That there's a dried cockroach in lavender mist. And so there is, despite the deliberateness, right? He's aware of incorporating chance. And you think back to it's not that gross. It's just a cockroach, Mary. Anything, well, it's probably decomposed a bit already, right? Anything can dry out. Look at mummies, you know. Things dry out, they desiccate, and then they're preserved, right? Yeah, why didn't it rot or something? It's exoskeletal, right? I mean, it's got the hard stuffs on the outside already, you know. People have dried bugs, and go look at an Egyptian museum and how many dried beetles there are, you know. That's not a hard thing. But think about, right, this embrace of chance. And remember Duchamp with the large glass? And he's delivering it to a show. He's been working on it for 7 years, and they drop it, and it cracks, and he goes, ooh, now it's done. Right? It's just this idea of embracing the things you can't control within it, right? But again, for Pollock, he's seeing these very much as a record of his presence and a record of activity, right? And that's part of the titling. Other thing I noticed more recently, handprints. I'd never sort of checked this out before, right? But there are handprints everywhere, right? There, up here, upper left corner, right? And you have to imagine he's down there, right? And he's painting, and so there's these places where he's actually leaned into the picture, even though they're toward the edge, and we have these images of his hands, upper right corner, images of his hands pressed into the canvas as well. So despite the fact that he never really touches it with a paintbrush, right, he does touch it, right, and he is leaving these I think become very potent symbols of this connection between his art and this idea of his activity, recording his activity, right? And the titles enter into this. So we happen to have number 25 around town as well. It's never on display. I've never seen it. I had to download this from them, right? But number 25 from 1950, and you can see that he's not always in the same color palette. He changes that up quite a bit, changes the scale, changes the dimensions. But the titling of these things, the fact that the title includes the date, right, goes back to this idea that, again, it's autobiographical in its way, right? It's capturing that particular moment, what's going on in his life, so that he can review it and revise it and think about that self-actualization, right, of these activities. He wasn't always dripping. He actually began as a realist painter, doing sort of regional scenes. He's from Cody, Wyoming, of all places, right? And a lot of people writing about Pollock talk about how this Wild West mentality is part of who he is, a six-shooter at the OK Corral or something like that, right, and gunning. And come to New York, studied at the Art Students League. We'll talk more about that in a second. But some of his earlier works, which are still more traditionally painted, by that I mean with brushes, touching the canvas, are picking up on mythological themes. And again, we've seen the importance of mythology to anybody who studies Jung, because Carl Jung said that this is one of the places the collective unconscious can be tapped, is by looking at mythologies from different cultures. And so Pasiphae, you know this, she's the mother of the Minotaur. Right? So she's the wife of King Minos, who got tricked into having sex with a bull. And that gave birth to the Minotaur. So she's the mother of madness as well. Right? Because the Minotaur is linked, as we saw with Picasso, the Minotaur is this common symbol for madness. Because the labyrinth, right, is you can't get out of. And that's madness. Right? So the Minotaur is this long-term symbol of being insane, of insanity. And so Pasiphae is the mother of insanity, right? And in this particular case, Pollock is basically showing that what he's trying to mine out of these, by titling and things like this, is to mine from those mythologies some other insight into the collective unconscious. It's similar in aims, although different in means, to his drip paintings, right? Now, I was just looking at it this morning, and I realized, because I taught this before, and where is she? And I realized I saw something there. All of a sudden, I saw a composition I knew that would make all sorts of sense. It's this old Minoan fresco of this is 2500 BC, right, on the island of Crete, in the palace that we think it was the basis for the myth of King Minos, because it has a labyrinth in it, right? And they did crazy things with bulls. Makes sort of sense. And you can see where that composition gets picked up in the Pollock in the middle, right? So here's our leaping bull, there's the front thigh, there's the back, and then the figure in the back here, right? Another figure up over here, but they've been translated out of that. So calling it Pasiphae is that he's looking back, and again, right, ancestral ideas that have filtered down to us, going back to as early a work as you can kind of some of the earliest work you can find. Not some of, but we're getting way back there to really what is a primarily prehistoric age. There's not a whole lot of writings from that period. So he's looking back at this. He's giving us a modernized Abex version of that, right? Titles it Pasiphae to tie it back to that original link. And again, is using it as a way of investigating our shared legacy, right? And again, this is a very, very humanist approach to painting, trying to find out something that is universal to all humanity. Sometimes, as he begins to drip, and the drips start around 1943, but they don't just replace the earlier work all at once. But as he begins to drip, he's doing sort of what Masson was doing with open starts. And then what do they suggest? And sometimes he gives them these kind of open-ended titles, like this one, that allude without defining, right? Water birds. What does he mean by that, right? Are they just meant to be ornithological studies of a bird that nests in water? Or is there something else about it? And Pollock said that he actually chose to pull a veil over the meaning. He wanted to veil the imagery. In other words, because each one of us are trying to tap into this shared unconscious, this collective unconscious, if he spells it out too directly, then it becomes his tap and it couldn't be yours. But if he leaves it open, then Lena can get into it from her path, Hunter from her path, right? It allows it, it opens it up to each one of us using it in the way that we might. These early drips have a very different color palette, right? This is right around the time he begins to drip. The drip paintings begin 1943 and seem to have started around the time that he starts really heavily engaging with Jungian psychoanalysis. So they're directly related to that. They're not all huge, like the one at the National Gallery. These ones are about 2 feet or so tall, right? They're more like easel pictures, if you will. But certainly also, I believe, putting them on the ground in order to do it, right? So when we talk about what pushed Pollock to make his art, I've been focusing so far primarily on this idea of the collective unconscious, which is definitely crucial. But there's also some old school art historical influences. In other words, other artists, other works that influenced him to pick up this new style, right? Independent from or adding to his own personal engagement with psychoanalytic theory. And one of them is obviously surrealism. André Masson, automatic painting, is one of the most primary, direct technical influences on not only the technique of dripping, but also some of the formal language he develops. And of course, these two things go hand in hand. Masson had moved to New York City in 1940. Pollock picks up drip painting in 1943, right? Just do the math, right? Prior to that, he wasn't doing it. So automatic painting, action painting, direct connection. Difference, of course, Masson is interested in this Freudian idea of getting back to birth, and Pollock in this Jungian idea about tapping into something more universal, right? When he moves to New York, Masson does slightly more figurative works based on his experiences as a refugee coming out of Europe. So No Finished World, a very large picture up in Baltimore, is intended with these figures that still retain some of the, nebulous, organic shapes from his drip pictures, becomes much more figurative, with the idea of being a metaphor for the horrors of Europe that he left behind. And you can see that Pollock, even after turning to drips, will turn back from them. And that this figure, again, with this elusive, quasi-mythological title of water figure, right, Is it Neptune, right? Is it one of the sea nymphs? It doesn't really say, but it's definitely figural. And you can see, I think, as you look back and forth between Pollock's water figure and Masson's figures in No Finished World, the degree to which some of those forms Pollock is picking up on. Right? So we can trace the influence of Masson in a number of different ways on the works of Jackson Pollock. So that's one of our three major art historical references, apart from the psychoanalytic issues. The second one is a painter named Hans Hofmann, who's actually an incredibly important painter in the history of modern painting. He taught at the Art Students League. He's a German. He expatriated from Germany in 1932 when Hitler came to power, right? Moved to America and was teaching at this school in New York called the Art Students League, which I think is still there, right? As an institution for studying art, the Art Students League. And Pollock studied there, right? So he studied under Hofmann. And Hofmann is credited with doing the very, very first drip paintings in 1938, right? So that's 5 years before Pollock decides to do it. His mentor at the Art Students League is doing it as well. So Hofmann is another major influence on Pollock's work. And Hofmann is known for a theory laid at the center of his teaching, which is called the theory of push and pull. And what the push and pull theory was for him, the way he taught it, was that with every painting, there exists a tension, visual tension, between the flat surface of the picture and the illusion of depth, right? So we've been talking about this ever since the first day of class, right? This tension between the painting as an object, a flat thing, and the painting as a representation, a window onto some three-dimensional objects that extends our space. And that tension was escalated in the Renaissance, right? With the idea of perspective and creating 3D space on a 2D surface. Okay? So Hofmann is focusing on this idea of that inherent tension in painting between the way in which the surface pushes. That's the push of the push and pull, right? It asserts itself forward. And the way in which the paint creates a dynamic of space. That's the pull. Pulls you into it. And for Hofmann, it's all achieved via color. It's not achieved via representation. It's not achieved via chiaroscuro, the shading in light and dark, right? It's achieved simply through color and the way in which certain colors recede more than other colors do. That gives you the pull of the push and pull. And this is the guy under whom Pollock has studied, right? And is moving toward an abstract form that allows him to develop this idea of the push of the canvas and the pull of the space without actually using representation, right? And so this is another of this is our second sort of monster influence on Pollock, right, is Hans Hofmann. Right? The third one, and a little bit less obvious when you see them side by side, Masson is like a boom, visually, you see it, right? And Hofmann, it's pretty easy to get. But our third one is a little bit less easy to see, which is Mondrian. And again, this goes back to this idea of how many artists are ending up in New York. 1930, 1940, right? Now, what links Mondrian to Pollock? Mondrian was the first artist, going all the way back to 1919 and continuing even in his New York years, the first artist to make paintings that didn't have a figure against a ground, where there wasn't a positive and negative space, where everything played a role, right? All over paintings, right? There isn't a background, there isn't space around the figure, right? There isn't negative space to be talked about. Everywhere you look, the composition spreads all over the canvas. And he'd been doing it at this point for 25 years in his life, right? Spends the last 3 years of his life in New York. Again, 42, 43, 44, that is exactly when Pollock begins really pushing this idea of the drip paintings as being all over paintings. Having that sort of carpet look, where every section has part of the design. There isn't a figure against the ground. And the earlier works like Pasiphae, like one of the water figures we saw, let's go back real quickly, right? Still have a figure against the ground, right? There still is that triangular headed thing. You can make out the neck, you can make out the figure, and you can determine what parts of it are figure, what parts of it are ground. He's working toward making sure that they're all parts of an active composition, but he has still got something against something else as a mode of composition. And with Mondrian, we move toward works like the one on the left, where there isn't a discernible subject matter, right, that sits against a background of sorts, right? It's an all-over picture. So these things are what leads Pollock, right, to drip painting, are these different elements, certainly driven in an idea way by surrealism, by psychoanalysis, but then certain artistic influences as well. Again, surrealism being key, but also Hans Hofmann, also Piet Mondrian, less obviously, but equally important, right? It'd be nice to spend a lot of time with Pollock, just continue to look at details. But we need to move on to our other Abex painters, other abstract expressionists. When I was sitting where you are, given my druthers, I would take Franz Kline over Jackson Pollock any day. I still quite like him. I've grown to like Pollock a lot more. But there's something about the broad gestural quality of Kline's work that I've responded to even before I liked abstract art. And we're very lucky to have quite a few here. And they're huge. This is 6.5, 7 feet tall, right? Again, mural-sized, which is a lot of our abstract expressionist painters are working so large because they're trying to really transform society. They see this as being important enough to function as murals did, right? So he's another action painter, right? You can see it's very, very gestural, like de Kooning had been, like Pollock is, although different, but certainly the gestures, the strong gestures are everywhere. He's painting with house painting brushes, like big 3-inch, house painter's brushes to get that broad gesture on the wall, right? He would pin these things to the wall, again, like Pollock did, not stretched on a canvas, but simply nailed to the wall to work on them, right? And the way he got to these compositions was really quite deliberate. He began with smaller compositions on paper, and you can see that as he's sort of working this out, he's not only painting on just scraps of, this is the Brooklyn telephone book, right? But he's collaging the pieces together to end up with the shapes that might lead him to bigger compositions. And de Kooning's wife tells the story of watching Franz Kline work. These guys were all friends, right? Of watching Franz Kline work and saying that what he would do was he would take these and put them in one of those opaque overhead projectors. You know the old things you used to see in grade school? A big light roar made this huge sound, and you put the thing and it would clunk, and it would come up and it would show something that was opaque on the wall, right? Not like, or like the Mylar things, but since it's opaque, you guys have it. And then he would just project these things on the wall and use that as the basis for what he was starting, right? And work on it up on the wall after having worked on it small. So, and he said when he saw them on the wall, he was really impressed with, they looked great little, but he said they looked really great big, right? And he wanted to then capture that. And he didn't do that with every picture, right? He's not tracing the smaller compositions. There's no one-to-one orientation. But what he did was he determined how it would look big by using one of those overhead projectors to see, how to map it out. Don't you wish you would, Mary, don't you wish you'd heard this before? Wouldn't that have been a great thing to do with your little pictures? And now what do I have to do to make it big, right? For the future, right? You're not done yet. You're done with Marymount, but you're not done with that, right? Go see Mary's pictures. It's got big pictures based on Kandinsky and the student in the senior show. They're very good, right? And yes, next to the library. So there's Franz Klein to give you a sense of scale. Yeah, hers are actually in the real Barry Gallery, which is that alcove. So just give you a sense of scale, right? He was projecting these things on the wall and then working huge, right? Absolutely massive against the wall. And you can imagine, again, like Pollock, the degree to which the engagement with the work of art is an immersion, right? When you're working on that scale, you are not someone looking at it. You are someone who lives inside of it, right? And you become part of it for a while. And it really is tracing all of your body movements. Even if you're climbing up and down a ladder, moving side to side, it's not just your arm anymore. It's not just your hand, right? It's you, everything about you affecting that picture and the way that it looks. Now, his formal language is fairly limited. He does some in color early on and every now and then back and forth. But this is the ones he's most remembered for, these stark black and white gestures, where he's got these amazing broad strokes across the canvas. And the question has always come up of, where do they come from? What's inspiring him? One of the things we know is that he grew up in industrial part of Pennsylvania, Wilkes-Barre. And a lot of people have pointed to these old industrial ironworks that were part of the landscape in this part of PA. And how when you see them against the bright sky, you all of a sudden end up seeing things that look very, very similar to the sorts of things he's painting. He's not representing it, right? But inspired by that stark black and white contrast of these angular forms on a massive scale, right? Translated here, Lena.
That almost reminds me back when we were studying the constructivist when they would take the photos of all the wire.
Yeah, very. Although I don't know if he's working from photos or if he's working from memory, right?
With the forms against, where you're not taking the representation of the actual structure, but
that's a good point.
The
right.
Silhouette of it.
Right, exactly. So using it as the matrix by the springboard, right, for your triple axle dive, right? Yeah, and so this was a nice picture, but you can see numerous things in the Rust Belt that would have certainly translated into Klein's works. Other people have said that they think he might have been looking at Chinese calligraphy. And there's something about the brush work, and you think about if you ever watched a Chinese calligrapher in action, right? The quickness of the brush work. And they do sort of look quasi like Chinese characters, excerpted, edited, and then exploded, right? But what that does is it doesn't take into account the way he's painting. And what's fascinating about these, and again, one of the great benefits of being here in DC is getting to see them live, is that he's not just painting black strokes against a white ground. It's not that simple. And in fact, he's building it up slowly but surely, coming over one with the other, and then coming back over the edges of the black with some white. And you can see it's slightly discolored at the bottom of that. I guess is that the 4? I don't want to be so trite, right? But you can see where some of the paint has come back over the black, and we see this kind of everywhere. At the same time, these wonderful traces of the splatter from the paint as he's slapping it down. But here at the very bottom, right, you can see that that tailing end of that open space is in fact painted right back over the black. So to think of it as Chinese calligraphy kind of misses the point, in that a Chinese calligrapher is only painting the figure, the black, right? And Klein, while he might have been inspired in part by that, is really painting everything with equal vigor, whether it's the white or the black. Right? I'm going to show you 3 Kleins just so you get a sense of what these all look like, right? This one is named after a famous choreographer, Merce Cunningham, modern dance choreographer, and Franz Klein was friends with Merce Cunningham. It's too many similar consonance in that, right? And they taught together at this, it's still there, this art college in North Carolina, Black Mountain College, where a lot of people from the Bauhaus showed up, right? There as well. And so Franz Kline was painting there at the same time that, teaching painting there at the same time that Merce Cunningham was teaching choreography, dance, right? And this was intended as an homage to the greatness of his colleague, right? To the things that Merce Cunningham was actually doing at Black Mountain College. And so he sees it as being, the black forms, he says, were intended to represent sort of dancers on a stage. And the way that Cunningham taught dance, and the way most people understand dance, is that it's a way of engaging with space. And dance is not just the figure, but dance is the space in which the figure moves, right? And to appreciate dance, you appreciate its the way in which the movements of the dancer affect the space around it, right? Engage with that space. And so Kline sees the two primary vertical blacks as being dancers that are engaging the space, the whites, around them. Right? Now the difference in tonality here, by the way, is just white balance on the camera, right? They're both the same tonality. So it's like he's mixing some peach into his paint here, right? It's just a different day, camera reacted differently, right? So, again, homage to his friend, but again, with his works. Now, there's some interesting things here. If you look closely at the work, you can see that he's building the paint. Some of it has been watered down. Watered down is not the right word, turpentine down, right? To the point where it can be applied more smoothly. That's probably from the influence of Gorky, who began to add turpentine to his paint. We saw that with 1 year, the milkweed on Tuesday. But if we look closely at the drips, you'll notice that the drips, all of them, run horizontally. Which means that he actually painted this, 90 degrees, right, from here, while it's hanging on the wall. Because we know, like we said, that he hung, he'd nail these things to the wall, paint them, and then he would frame them, right, for display. And so as he's working on this, he's working on it horizontally. Yet he still intends it to be these figures, which means he's sort of thinking about it vertically while working on it horizontally. And the question is whether or not the idea of them being the figures is an afterthought. Something that came to him when he flipped it 90 degrees. And again, that post-Dada embrace of chance, of open-ended starts that you don't know where it's headed. And then you get the lucky accident that turns it that way. So he's again beginning at 90 degrees right, flips it and sees the figures in it and turns it into Merce Cunningham, right? But he does that a lot with his pictures. There's quite a few Klines where if we look at the splatters, if we look at the runs, the streaks, we find that he painted it one way rather than the other. And since these are so large, Merce C is, I don't have it. It's again about 6 feet tall, right? You wonder if turning it on its side isn't just out of convenience. Because if it's 6 feet tall and it's on its side, then you can get to the whole thing. Because it's much easier to do this than it is to do this, right? Side to side versus up and down. And so you wonder if it's just simply a matter of convenience that's making Kline choose to flip them or not. And I don't think that's it. I think it's more about not knowing where he's headed when he starts, because it's the gesture, it's the action, right? This isn't in my notes, but one of the I don't know if I told you guys this, but one of the legends around Kandinsky about how he finally decided to stop making paintings that had like a sea battle or something in them and decided to go full abstract, right? Fully non-representational. The story is, did I tell you this? The story is he came home one night and he flipped the light on in the studio and he looked over and he saw this picture and he goes, "What is that?" Right? And what it was one of his pictures, but it was turned upside down and he couldn't recognize the subject matter. And that made him go, I don't need the subject matter, right? All I need are the colors. by having seen it misoriented. So I wonder if, whether or not Klein sort of knows this story about how to make it that much more focused on gesture versus figure by flipping it as you work. It's not entirely about convenience, however, because this one, again, just as big, if not even a little bit bigger, actually seems to flip the other way. So if we look more closely here, we can see that with some of the drips, that obviously the drips are moving like this, right, across that canvas. And so this one he seems to have kicked up 90 degrees and then flipped it down again. So again, I think that when we're talking about his process for recording the action gesture, we're getting these works that he's doing what he can to make sure that it removes one more step from any attempt at representation. And I think the flipping of them adds to that, right? Adds to that sense that this is not about representation. Right? So action painting, which we've seen now in 1, 2, 3 different artists, right? Arguably Hans Hofmann too, but the 3 that we looked at, Pollock, Gorky, 4, Gorky, Pollock, Klein, de Kooning, right? Is one of 2 different trajectories within abstract expressionism. Okay? Action painting is one direction. There's another group of painters that have been lumped into this group called abstract expressionism that don't do gestural action painting, but do instead what's called field painting, where like Pollock, like Klein, is kind of an overall picture, right, where we're working on covering the entire canvas with something, but more of it is taken up with broad fields of color. And so our first of these, we're going to look at just 2 of them, of these field painters is Barnett Newman. So this is the antithesis to action painting. And in fact, often, at least at first, it seems less interested in recording gestures. Right? The paintings watered down quite a bit. Again, most of them got this idea from Gorky, Arshile Gorky. And if you get close enough, you can see gestures, but the impression from a distance is that it could have been painted with a roller or something, right? And in this case, all it is this red field with these 2 different lines running through it of different colors and different thicknesses. And this is Barnett Newman's signature style. This majority of his works look like this. Not all of them, but the ones that are best known are these images with these lines running through them. And he called these lines zips, which I think is kind of cool, right? They called them his zips. And the way he made them was not consistent. Often he would block it out with masking tape in order to get the precision of the edges. And when we get in close to some of them, we can find the built-up paint on the edge of the zip. Other ones, he would start that way, then he would sort of play with the edge so it's not nearly as regularized as that. And he said that the zips, no matter how he did them, whether the paint was built up against the field or whether it was blended, and I think with these you can already begin to see that the one on the left is a bit more blended than the one on the right. But they're not meant to be objects. He doesn't see the zips as being the figure against a red ground. In explaining his pictures, he said the zips were a passageway through the canvas. That they were a way to move past the surface of the canvas into something else. Right? And that something else was the spiritual realm. That the field represented the boundary between your physical world and the physical world, or the spiritual world. And the zips were the places where you could move from here to there. So through the zips, and not available to our vision, is this spiritual realm, as Newman explains it, right? That's what he's hoping to get across. And this is part of the reason many of his pictures have religious titles. Covenant, right? The covenant, the covenant, religiously speaking, is God's promise for our salvation, whether in Judaism or Christianity, right? That's the covenant, is his promise that if we do this, we will achieve salvation, right? And different for Judaism versus Christianity. So this painting is the covenant in that it allows us now, because that salvation is entering into a spiritual realm, right? So the painting now becomes the covenant. It becomes his ability to allow us to move to a more spiritual place. And the idea that abstraction, right, paintings that do not represent the physical world, the idea that those are spiritual is something that we've talked about ever since sort of the second week of class, right? And it's arguably something that has come up in the history of art over centuries, millennia, is the idea that abstraction is closer to spirituality. Because Renaissance works, for example, remind us of where we are. They remind us of the physical world, right? So standard perspective and the use of chiaroscuro are ways in which painters remind us of the here and now. And there's always, with religious pictures, been a tension between celebrating the physical world and trying to remind your viewers of spiritual concepts. There's always been tension, right? How do you get somebody to focus on spiritual? Michelangelo. Think about Michelangelo, okay? Can you close your eyes and think Michelangelo? Well enough to, okay? Big, muscular Jesus, right? I should have had him up here. Michelangelo, right, would love nothing more than these massive superhuman figures to evoke some of the glory of God. But the problem is that they're just big, muscular guys that remind us of being human. And for him, that was always there was a tension there, right? And you stir into that tension the second commandment, right? Moses, you shall make no images, right? It's a problem. So throughout the history of art, we've seen this tension play out in a number of different ways. To where, for example, in the 9th century and again in the 16th century, you had people destroying images because people shouldn't be making them. That's God's job. Iconoclasm, right? The destruction of images happened during periods of religious zealotry. The idea that art should not be representational. And we often find as well that artists, when they're trying to amplify and focus on the spiritual element of what they are depicting, will sort of downplay the physical nature. Figures become flatter. Spaces become more artificial. Think of icons, religious icons with gold backgrounds and sort of unmodeled bust-length figures of saints staring at you. You know? They're not particularly realistic. And through time, we've seen artists, again and again, turning to abstract to amplify spirituality. In this particular case, and this is a really fascinating, this is happening right after World War II. That is when, World War II and after is when Pollock, Newman, Klein, Gorky are getting really into this idea of gesture and abstract expressionism, right? It's happening in the middle of the 40s. And it is impossible to ignore the coincidence with World War II, right? The horrors of the war. And if we think back to what we've learned before, right? We think about Mondrian and Kandinsky during World War I. How the horrors of war led them to embrace abstraction, because the world sucks, right? The other fascinating thing is at the same time this is happening, there's this art historian who's moved from Germany to America. His name is, hang on a second, Max Friedlander. And he writes this book about art produced in Siena, Italy, after the Black Plague of 1348. And now he looked back and saw that in art produced in the late part of the 14th century, artists turned their back on Giotto, turned their back on the early development of the Renaissance for something more abstract, to enhance the spiritual quality in the face of horror, right? And writing that in 1948, the same time that his colleagues in the same city are making paintings that are doing the same thing, right? So it's a fascinating moment, right? So Newman, his zips are these places where we, through titles like Covenant, we can escape, move into a secularized salvation, right? A spiritual realm, and leave behind us the horrors of the physical world. I cut a slide out, but there you get the. He's not against also turning to non-Christian religion. So Dionysus, the god of wine. Of course, covenant also refers to the idea of blood, right? Blood and wine within the Christian tradition. But here, Dionysus, referring back now to the Greek god of wine, and we've talked so much about mythology already that I don't have to go back over that again, right? And bring that into it. But now we can see close up, because I was able to get better photos of this one, because the Hirshhorn never has the old stuff out anymore. They're all contemporary these days, right? So I have to just get their stuff offline. But you can see here where the zip has been laid over the top. And you can even see how part of the paint's pulled up from removing the masking tape after having laid it down. But again, he sees these not as surface elements, but rather as openings, right? as points in which we can enter. And you can see that in this particular case, it's very tightly inscribed, paint laid on more thickly than the background, and quite obviously done with masking tape, right? Whereas the other line isn't, or at least not entirely, right? Masking tape across the bottom, but then at the top he starts to work with some of the edges, blur them together with this thinned out paint. And sometimes it seems working also wet on wet. And then I'm not even 100% sure whether the top blue-green was added before or after the orange, right? You can also see that he's changed his mind, I think. I haven't seen the conservators' report, but can you see that light yellow line running across underneath the turquoise? As if perhaps he decided to move that orange down a bit, or he was just simply working something else into it. All of these works, when we look at these details like this, are intended to be meditated upon. They're not just intended to be looked at quickly and walked away from. The scale of them, again, very, very large pictures, 5-6 feet tall, are intended as environments that you spend time in as you meditate. Now, our last field painter and one of the rock stars of 20th century art is Mark Rothko. And I'm not just saying that because he used to teach in Portland, where I'm from. I didn't get to take classes with him. He was out of it by that point. But I think Rothko's work is one of these things that once you understand what's going on in a Rothko, they're fantastic. Just fantastic pictures. And I would, even larger still, right? This one is, I think I've got it down. It's on title, 1953. Yeah. 77 inches, so that's 6.5 feet tall, right? And so again, these field paintings, like the action paintings, are meant not to look at from afar, but to move back and forth. Come in, move out, come in, move out. And he's watering down his paint like Newman had done. Thinning down his paint is a better term because it's oil paint. And applying it in a deceptively simple manner. All of them are untitled. Sometimes you'll see museums refer to them as, pink and black and orange, right? But there's more to them than just that. And the technique with which he applies the paint becomes, like an action painting, part of the subject matter. And you can see very clearly how the paint is scrubbed into this canvas. But like Gorky, he's thinning it down so much that he's really... Let's go back to the nature of push and pull, right? You got the push, which is the canvas, the surface, okay? And when you lay paint on the surface, we often think about it as you're putting the stuff on the top of it, right? You got the gesso layer down on the canvas, and you put the paint on top of that gesso layer. It sits on that surface, and conservators often can strip it off of that and put it on a different surface if you need to, right? But we don't spend much time thinking about the surface as having much to do with the rest of it. It's just going to cover that, right? It's a support. And in fact, we often just call it the support, okay? When you thin the paint down, right, when you add turpentine to it, what happens is, instead of putting the paint on the surface, it permeates it. You stain the surface. Does that make sense? Right? So think about the way you treat a deck in a house with stain, where you still see the wood, but it's been colored, and it's soaked into the wood. And the way you treat the rest of the house, which is you paint it, and you cover it up with a layer of paint that protects the wood, right? Both of them kind of do the same thing. They both protect the wood. One of them gets rid of the wood as an element. The other one allows it to be seen, and at the same time, one of them becomes something on something else, right? A on top of B. Whereas if it's staining, A and B are the same thing. Right? You can't get the paint off the canvas anymore. It is the canvas now. Right? It's been stained. The difference between dropping here's a horrible metaphor, but you're eating dinner, and you drop a piece of pasta in your lap, and you pick it up, and your clothes are fine. But if you drop a spot of olive oil in your lap, then your clothes are forever changed, right? So he's staining the canvas, right, with his application of the paint. He's making this object, right, that is itself the color, right? There's no longer a separation between paint and object. And you can see this when you get up close, right? The way in which he's scrubbing it in and allowing the paint to simply stain into the canvas. A deeper stain in some parts, I don't want to say thicker, that's not the right word, right? A deeper stain in some parts, a thinner stain in others. And you can see that things you might ignore become important parts of the composition, like that gray background. Now, I don't know how far it extends, right? Behind that pinkish purple. But you can see also he's picked up some of the other colors within it, along the left border, some of that pink. And what he wants us to do with these images, as we get close and see the changes to the paint and how it's different everywhere we look, he wants us to meditate. He wants us to take a moment out, stop what you're doing day by day, and dive in, right? So they're deceptively simple, right? And he leaves a lot of things going on if we approach it in the right mindset. This idea of meditation, of release from our daily experience. There are rewards for us here, which might seem at first not to be there. And the more you look at these, they become landscapes in a way. You start to see some of those bright red elements that come up over the purple on the upper left of the detail, or over to the right side, as being the tops of trees, but in a sort of dream landscape way, right? And I do think that on a certain level, even though he is committed to non-representational painting, these paintings are dreamscapes. These paintings are, especially the ones with a strong horizon line like this, are intended as, think about surrealism, right? Think about Yves Tanguy. Think about Dali, right? Dream landscapes were an important part of that, and I think that these are non-representational dreams. These are the kind of things you remember when you think of dreams and the kinds of spaces you move through in dreams. That there's definitely, it appears, horizon-like elements in the ways in which the parts come together. And as you do what he wants you to do, which is to step back, enter in, And you stop looking at it as the overall organization, which is certainly part of the composition. And you start to look at it instead as this environment that you're entering. Then the painting begins to change for us, and it begins to take on these elements of offering us this peaceful respite where we can go. Detail on the right, you can see that with this particular picture, the orange is under everything at the bottom, right? And it's allowed to sort of come through as well, right? I just think these are fantastic pictures, right? We mentioned Calder, the fact that with the new National Gallery installation, there's a Calder room. There's also a Rothko room with at least 10 to 12 of these up, right? It's just fantastic and wonderful to come into and go back from. Now, Rothko didn't always paint this way, right? He didn't start from day one painting field paintings. Rather, he also started as a figurative artist and then began to move into abstraction, began to be very much influenced by surrealism, all of our expats we were talking about, the same people, André Masson in particular, but also this interest in mythology that we saw with the surrealists, that we saw with the other abstract expressionists. Antigone, who knows who Antigone is? Lena?
Wasn't she a princess and she got caught in the cave? It's been a while.
No, that's not her.
There's a death in the end.
Everybody dies in the end.
That's
She
all.
was, the legend of Oedipus. Oedipus, the king, gets tricked, mistakenly sleeps with his own mother. He doesn't intend to sleep with his mom, but he gets confused, right? And has to sleep with his mother. And they have a child. Antigone is, sorry?
Is that where you think that is?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. So Oedipus has a child with his own mother. Antigone is the child. So she's Oedipus's sister and his daughter. Yeah, icky. That's the exact same face Karen made this morning when I was putting the slides together and talking about this, right? Yeah. So, so this comes back to so then here's the question you should ask yourself. If Jung says that myths are where we discover our common humanity, then what the heck, right? Why should we turn to this myth of, what does this possibly have to tell us about our shared common humanity, our collective unconscious, an image that refers to the sister-daughter of Oedipus, the mistake that he made, right? Are you raising your hand to answer this? Give it a go.
Sigmund Freud's thing, the son wants to kill the father in order to wed the mother, and the daughter wants to kill the
Well,
mother.
the idea of an Oedipal complex, right, is definitely comes out of Freud. But the big difference, and that's a very good point, James. I think that's good. One of the things to keep in our mind is that that certainly is probably still here. We tend to, when we analyze these pictures, make a distinction between the people who are doing Freud and the subconscious, and the people who are doing Jung and the unconscious, because these are not the same thing, right? The subconscious is you and me. My own subconscious affects how I behave. Whereas the collective unconscious is this shared ancestry that affects not only me, but you, right? So I think that's definitely part of it, right? The idea of Antigone being a huge part of psychoanalysis anyway, right? Of the Oedipus complex, right? The other thing about Antigone is that there's a different part of her story where she ends up being quite heroic. Oedipus's other brother was accused of treason. Polynices is his name, right? Was accused of treason and was executed for treason. And was part of the punishment was that his body would be laid out on the ground to rot and get eaten by birds. And Antigone intervened and buried her brother. Right? And for this she was arrested. And at the arrest she makes this speech about faithfulness to your common man, about doing good by your neighbors, and just sort of takes them down a notch about the punishment is too much, and I as his sister owe it to him. So there's this humanist bond from that part of the story, right? Now, Rothko's not really illustrating any part of the story per se, right? He's giving it a title that very much like everybody else, surrealist or Abex, has emphasized sort of the open-ended nature of interpretation, right? But it's important to remember that mythology stands at the back of it, and there's this, I don't want to say seamless, but there is a really strong connection between American and European surrealism and abstract expressionism that we might miss it if all we think about is Salvador Dali, right? Because when we think surrealism, we go, oh, Magritte, oh, Salvador Dali, and we just think about these things that are sort of precisely rendered objects that are recognizable but weird, right? But that's not really all surrealism was, right? Surrealism was also a way of thinking, right? And a way of tapping into other elements. And that trickles over into abstract expressionism quite strongly. Well, I'm going to make it through this. When Masson gets to New York, he starts to pick up automatic painting, right? And he even says, and he starts to water down his works like Gorky had been doing, right? That also seems to have come out of contact with Masson, was this idea of thinning out your paint. And he starts to now stain the canvases, right? And that's certainly what Masson was doing with the milkweed picture, right? But he said that always, that the forms that he's doing, and he writes this later when he's painting things like this, he says, my forms are actors on a stage, which also seems to suggest mythologies, because so many of our knowledge of the myths come through people like Sophocles, right, the great Greek playwrights. And so here it's still quasi-figurative, isn't it, in a way? You can almost see these being dancers or performers moving about within a space. But they seem much more open-ended, much more automatic painting inspired, closer almost to action painting in a way. But this is now how he develops. And slowly but surely, not in one direct line, they become increasingly abstract, where you can still see the sense of actors on a stage moving around, but the paint gets thinner, it starts to bleed, the edges bleed into each other more because he's using increasing amounts of turpentine and staining the canvas and interested in that interaction of the paint soaking in, not only to the canvas, but soaking into the other paints, but still moving now by 1948 into closer to what his signature style is. And it's almost the next year after this, 49, that he hits on this idea. Panes of color against a ground. That becomes pretty much all he does for the rest of his life. He varies the sizes, the shapes, the proportions, the colors. But from 1949 onwards, this is what he does. Different variations of these. The nice thing is, here in DC, the Rothko Foundation bequeathed everything that was left when he died to the National Gallery. I think like around 700 Rothkos in the National Gallery, right? And that's not counting what's over the Smithsonian American Museum, which doesn't have as many because they're almost all in the NGA, but also over the Phillips. We're really rich in Rothko here, which is wonderful. And here you see the same things we saw with sort of the pink and black picture, pink, black, and purple picture, is this playing with the way in which the paint interacts on the surface and interacts with the surface, where everywhere we look, we're meant to sort of come in, look closely, look at that green down below, and see how the yellow interacts with the green and which was painted first. It becomes a point of visual interest. How much orange comes through and where and why, and without turning to mud. You know, painters out there, mix orange and green and just see how far you get, right? Before you've got monkey shit brown, right? Lena.
So you said that when he thinned out the paint, that he rubs it into the canvas. Does he still use paintbrushes?
I think so. He did in the play. We went and saw Red when it was playing here. There was a Broadway, one best play about 5 years ago called Red, all about Rothko. And he was using brushes then. It's a good question. I think he's using brushes, but I think he's also using sponges, right? Big sponges for this. But don't quote me on that, right? Because there are places that look definitely okay. Look at the border between the green and the yellow at the bottom, and you can see brush strokes down there, right? There's a bit of white on the top, and here this details a little bit of it, but right. So there are these borders that definitely are hit with paintbrush, right? So that stuff down there is bristles of paint, and I think even through here you can get a sense. But I think some of it also looks as if he's been scrubbing at it with a large sort of natural. And when I say a sponge, it's not like the sponge you use in the kitchen. It's not going to be like that, right? It's going to be one of these big old natural things like that, right? That he's using. But again, this is what you're supposed to do. This is what he wants you to do. He wants you to come in, and when you do, and you spend some time staring at things like this, it's another world. It's another environment. It's a landscape of sorts, right? Not representational, but an emotional landscape. Here I did have a detail, right? You can see there's definitely some places where the brush is moving across, right? In here that were and again you can see the degree to which the paint has been thinned so much that so much of the turpentine is running down the surface too, as he's working on this. And I just think these are phenomenally beautiful works. And I want to sort of talk about the deeper meanings, but at a certain level there's just this aesthetic pleasure that comes from those peaks of blue that come in between the purple and the red, right? And they only become beautiful when you give it its due, right? When you go down and you spend some time sitting there quietly, right? Walking up close, going back, taking a seat. It's exhausting, actually. Last time I was in the Rothko room, I left it sort of at once drained and elated because it's not easy looking, and yet at first you think it would be just a cinch. These are going to be easy peasy to walk on by. And you can walk on by them, but you can walk on by anything, right? If you spend the time with them, if you approach them the way he wanted us to, then you get these incredible experiences, right? They're fantastic, aren't they? It's just like you see, when you see this, you just almost get, like it's an aurora borealis, you know? It's the northern lights. It's the best sunset you've ever seen, right? He's captured this incredible spiritual realm. That is a great escape from where we are. Now, with all I'm talking about with this, it's important to note that Rothko often designed things with a particular space in mind as well. He called some of these chapels, and in fact there are various places in Texas, in Fort Worth, there's a Rothko chapel, right, where he designed works to be in a church as spiritual escape. And Duncan Phillips started buying Rothkos in the 50s. He just fell in love with him. We talked about Phillips before, right? He's the one who supported Arthur Dove. And he bought 4 monster Rothkos from the 50s. And in 1960, he started to put together a small, intimate room where they don't want you to talk, right? It's a quiet, hushed room. And it was designed at the Phillips, this room, specifically to hang these 4 Rothkos in. We can't see the 4th one, right? It's behind us. Specifically to hang these 4 Rothkos in. And Rothko came and helped them to figure out the dimensions of the room, right? So he played a hand in the design of the Rothko room and talked about which ones should go where within the room, right? So it's one of these great places in D.C. is just go sit in the Rothko. And they won't let more than 4 people in at a time because it's not that big of a space, right? It's big enough. You can walk forward and back and, get a full view of things, but they want you to meditate. That's what these are all about, in meditation. And so I think we'll wrap up with just looking at the one on the right wall, right? Which is my favorite in the room. So, and I get to do that, right? When you teach a class, you can talk about your favorite. But again, it's just this idea of staining the canvas and the sort of happy discoveries you make, the more time you spend with it, right? The traces you see of how he's applied the paint, and then that beautiful filtered blue line that works its way across the top or down the sides, and the ways in which the paint interacts. And then sometimes, it's like looking at sunspots or something. You see images on NASA of sunspots where the sun has erupted, and you get these explosions of red that come out of the burgundy. Just fantastic, and again, give this sense of a space, environment that you're asked to now enter into, right? So I really can't think of a better place to stop what we've done than this, honestly. I mean, if we'd gone further, we would have gone further. That'd been great, but Abex and especially Rothko is a great place to stop because all of, I think in many ways, almost everything we've been talking about since the first week of class get kind of encapsulated right here, right? With this, the ability of a painting to be something more than a representation, right? And also its ability to help us to move past the worries, this is nice, move past the worries of everyday life as you move toward finals week and towards something wonderful. So spend your studying time, I was going to say, spend your time studying for this class by looking at the Rothkos. Go down to the Rothko room, okay? Friday at noon, I'm here most of the week, but if you want to come and see me, try to make an appointment because I got other things I'm here to be doing. And I'll definitely be around Friday morning before the exam if you have last minute questions on that, right? And again, papers, right, before I start grading tomorrow at 5, okay? No, all of your finals only meet on the day of the final. Yeah. I have someone who's made an appointment.